Yeah, we were talking about categories.
Yes.
And interface builder.
Yeah, so categories are a way to add a set of methods to an existing class. There's a simple syntax to do it, and at runtime, the classes methods and the category methods are unified so that the message dispatcher can find them. And it worked out great. People loved them. It's an interesting example going back to, I mentioned briefly before, the object-oriented programming is bad video that's popular out there and how classes are almost too structured. Categories are an example that are loosening that structure. And I think it's an example of adapting classes in a more useful way without being dogmatic about it. It's not a perfect world in that if you have two categories with two methods that are claiming the same implementation, there are ambiguities at runtime that can be difficult to resolve. So it's similar problems to multiple inheritance or the confusions that some people have with multiple inheritance, precedents of multiple ancestors, but it in practice it worked and people liked it. And it made things much easier than using the pose as hack. So again, a pragmatic, I think one of the things that drove me was doing something that made things better and useful and not evaluating it as linguistically perfect, but moving the ball forward. Because some of these problems don't have perfect solutions. And if you can solve the 98% case, do it. Rather than depend on a hack. Other people might make other decisions. I mean, I'm not saying it's right. But I know the reaction to categories was very positive. And I think you've used the feature, right?
Yeah. And today they're called
extensions?
Extensions, I think, yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. I think, I don't think they use the name categories anymore, but it's still there. Yeah,
And one of the inspirations was Common Lisp. I mean, Common Lisp was evolved from Lisp to be an object-oriented system, and Common Lisp classes are totally open. Anyone can add a method to a class. And that was sort of proof that, it works even if it's not perfect. So.
Right. And was Jean-Marie, I heard that Interface Builder had originally been developed in Lisp. Is that correct?
Yeah, I think he did the first Interface Builder for him in Lisp, and I forget where he did it. It wasn't at Next, but it's the implementation that I think he showed Steve, and where Steve basically got interested in Jean-Marie and said, come on board and do it in the infrastructure we're developing, and so he did. Okay. And Jean-Marie was just a real pro. You can imagine having some people from that background that would lobby, we have to move to Lisp because my tool's in Lisp. Right. There are people out there like that. But he was so pragmatic and so easy to work with, just a wonderful guy.
I mean, that's a really good example of how the language was modified to support the application or the
tool,
rather than the other way around.
Totally, and one of the reasons, like, people sometimes wonder why didn't Next choose C++? Because as we're going to talk about soon, we had to support that language, and supporting it for other people who are using it is different than basing your crown jewels on it. The reason we didn't use C++ is, simply put, it didn't have dynamic features that we needed. And we certainly weren't going to wait around for AT&T and Bjorn Strustrup to service our particular needs. And we knew we weren't big enough to influence them. So one of the things that Steve and the rest of the engineers who chose Objective-C were really smart about. Whether this was absolutely intentional or not, I can't say. I think having talked to Steve about it, I think from Steve's perspective, it was intentional, is that he knew they had more control over Objective-C than they would have C++. So, control and evolution was really important, and it just started out where they wanted to be. I mean, C++ being a better C, with all of its static sort of view on life, just wasn't that interesting to the folks at Next at the time. Yeah.
Yeah, you mentioned dynamic. Why was having a dynamic language in Runtime so important to Next?
Well, there's no doubt that it starts at Interface Builder in that when you have a palette of objects, part of that vision was having a custom palette of objects. And as soon as you talk about custom palettes of objectware or IC packs, you're talking about dynamic, right? Because the tool is not going to be statically aware of everything that can possibly be a part of it. I mean, you have the same issue, let's face it, like a PDF file. You have many different applications that can operate on the PDF file. Well, when you have a menu pick that populates with all the tools that know how to manipulate the PDF, that's dynamic, right? And so the whole notion of extending the data types that either Interface Builder or Finder or Workspace, I guess we called it, we knew that the system for the next generation was going to be dynamic. Dynamic is also, or I think from our perspective, rather than the rest of the world viewed dynamic as inefficient. And I think the more we learned, the more we realized, no, dynamic is actually more efficient from many perspectives. Maybe not all, but many. An example is, imagine you have all these kits with many classes. Well, one model is every kit you link against, that there is some overhead on a per kit basis. So you have 3 kits, each having 100 or 1,000 objects, and that independent of use, you're going to do some sort of initialization in anticipation of use. Well, that's how a static system would work. It's like, oh, you're linking against this library, it has to be prepared for its use. Well, one of the things I did in this early re-implementation of the runtime was all class initialization was lazy. So if you linked against a kit with 1,000 objects and you use 3, the only 3 that would get initialized and prepared for use would be the ones you use. So that's dynamic. The only way to scale is dynamic. It's really the only way to scale anything. And the way we grew up with slow processors and slow compilers, there really was this tendency that the machine is so feeble that let's do everything we can or learn everything we can about this piece of software when we have the opportunity. You don't want to defer anything. But we learned over time that that's not practical. As the system grows, it's not practical. Same thing with MAINSAIL. They did everything lazily. So if you linked against 100 modules, the only modules that got brought into memory and used were the ones you used. So there's just so many examples where another point is all of the early Unix systems didn't support the notion of a shared library, a dynamic shared library. They were statically linked. And Domain, the Aegis operating system for Apollo, had a really great dynamic shared library scheme. Amazing. And they influenced the industry because the Unix guys said, well, clearly that's better. And why did Apollo have that? Because these KCAD applications were being ported to it, and they were driven to do, I believe, architectures that scale better. So it's interesting, when I got to Next, they had a very feeble implementation of shared libraries that was based on Unix System 5. It was position-dependent shared libraries. What that means is developers actually had a list of symbols with the exact address where that symbol would be in memory. And the linker helped manage this. I don't forget all the details, but it was not position-independent code. It was not the compilers generating code that doesn't depend on where this resides. So that was another thing I lobbied for, was to move to position-independent shared libraries, more like what I had seen on Apollo or other modern systems of the day. And we, I made that a priority, and we did that before the 1.0 release. I think it was done before the 1.0 release, but it was definitely something that I lobbied for.
Mm-hmm. So you were the primary, I guess, the directly responsible individual, as they would say. I don't know if they used that term then, but you were the primary person responsible for the Objective-C runtime at Next.
Yeah. Oh yeah. No one else was working on it. When we hired Bertrand, I'd say within 4 to 6 months of me hiring on, Bertrand had great interest in the runtime, and worked with me and voiced opinions, and he had great experience and great insight, and he I'm sure he did influence stuff I was doing, but it wasn't his primary job, and he wasn't in the compiler group, but he was interested, and certainly later on other people got interested and offered insight, which again was really cool. I love people critiquing what it is I was working on. I'm not shy about, I never thought about that type of thing. Again, I think my music background lends itself to that, because the music is one of those domains where musicians are always paying tribute to other musicians by using their riffs and using their ideas, and it's considered goodness. In computer science and engineering, it's not always considered goodness depending on your background. I've worked with people who come from a very academic background, who sometimes only want to use the ideas they conceive of. And if other people are conceiving of them, even though it might be a better idea, they're not as prone to take it. And that in my experience is not the best path. So Bertrand, and as I said, he and I talked about the best hash schemes, about reentrancy. There were a lot of things he noticed that I'm sure we improved based on his feedback. And the runtime was small. That was one of my big things, is if I would have let everyone at Next have their pet feature or have everyone hack away at it, it could have ended up differently. But I was pretty strict about only letting really important stuff in. And it was easy to justify that at the time, since we were really behind the 8 ball in so many things, because we still didn't have a GNU compiler that understood it natively. That was like the next thing. First, it was getting the translator and a core runtime, and then hacking the compiler directly so we would have no preprocessor.
Let's actually talk about that next. But before we get into that, why do you think that GCC was selected in the first place to be the compiler? And was there any culture clash there? I mean, Next was doing a sort of proprietary system. Steve Jobs is known for proprietary systems. Was there a cultural mismatch using Stallman's stuff?
I didn't feel it if there was. As for why they chose GCC, I really don't know, except Steve Stone, who was in the trenches, I simply thought it was some good work and that they were kicking the tires. And they were kicking the tires, let's face it, with Objective-C too. And so the issue was, will they converge? Will this language converge enough for us to ship a product that isn't shitty? Will the compiler converge? The compiler was 1.0 and it was pretty respectable, but it still needed work. And I think on both fronts, that was my job, to make those two things shine for them. And it all worked out. I mean, Richard Stallman was an amazing person to work with. I can't say I subscribe to all his politics regarding free software and patents. I have patents. So Richard probably doesn't like me, because if you're someone whose name is on a patent or someone who doesn't universally give away everything you've ever done, you're bad. I mean, he's hardcore. So, but the fact that he's hardcore and politically I didn't necessarily buy into everything didn't affect me, because he was a brilliant programmer. He was a brilliant leader of GCC. And though GCC might not have been the most beautiful compiler ever written, from my perspective, it was really, really good for the time. It was very good for the time.
And it seems like the fact that you could get the source and modify it was a benefit to
Oh my
Next,
God.
because then you could add Objective-C.
I could add Objective-C. Yeah, and I did that, and it was not that much work. I mean, basically, you modified that. He had a tool called Bison, which was his take on Yak, which was a compiler. So I go into the rules and I add the Objective-C grammar and add the actions. The trickiest part about doing that project is not the syntax. Recognized syntax was fairly straightforward. It's that compiler was generating parse trees, generating data structures, complex composite data structures that needed to be extended to do Objective-C. And you needed to, in many cases, because under the covers, I was still generating C code, but rather than generating text, which was C, I was generating parse trees. So I had to synthesize Stallman tree nodes to make his compiler happy. And that was, the toughest part of the job. But once you did that, it just all worked. So his parse trees weren't all that necessarily clean or beautiful, but they were very highly functional. They made sense once you had, once you were past the learning curve, because it's a complex, fairly big compiler. And that part of the job, making GCC do Objective-C, wasn't that big a deal. And Richard was very helpful and fixed bugs when I found them, because clearly when you're just like the I guess shtick I had before about writing apps to prove a library, when you add a front end, you're proving the parse trees. And you're saying, how come this parse tree doesn't fit for what I'm doing? Let's modify. Is it the right thing to modify the parse tree or to have a separate data structure to do this, whatever that is? And so getting his architectural buy-in was very important, because I wasn't, but getting back to part of the question you asked, which I think now is coming to mind, is the one mismatch of cultures, so to speak, was Richard wanted everyone to be doing this work in the open, right? He wanted all the FSF, GCC development to every time I was doing anything to Objective-C to be done, integrated into the main line and done in clear view. But because Next and most companies operate on product timelines, it made much more sense for us to say, we want to work on Objective-C atop GCC until we ship our, let's say, 1.0 version. And when we ship our 1.0 version, we will then take all of our changes and work with you on integrating them, right? Now, Richard wasn't in love with that. Like for a while, people, oh, Next isn't being good citizens. They're not contributing back to. It was just a timing issue, a pragmatic issue. It wasn't any religious issue. We always wanted to give all of our work back to FSF. A more, I'd say, another obvious example of the discord between what Next was doing and what, let's say, free software does is if Next was going to introduce a new hardware platform with a new processor, well, Next was fairly secretive. If we give back, let's say, PowerPC changes or whatever the processor is, that's going to be a big red flag that, oh, Next is working on PowerPC, right? So, but see, to me, those problems, if they're really problems, is more a function of a product company versus an open-ended compiler development branch. So I don't know. Richard and I never really had a lot of personal problems. I know he's someone that still likes to badmouth Next and Apple. I don't know if he has any fond memories like I do of working with him. I doubt he does. He's not a warm and fuzzy type of guy. But I have nothing but good things to say about his contribution, not only to the compiler world, but to open software. I use the term open. He hates that. Free software. Sorry, Richard. And so many other things. So, in fact, one time he visited, and we were going to integrate and show him some of the work to get feedback because, again, we weren't doing it in the open. So he came to Next and worked with me. And, I don't think he and Steve ever really hit it off. The one time they met, I don't even think I was in the room. They duked it out by themselves. So I don't have any Richard Steve stories, but Richard, he was a quirky dude. Like when he was coming to see us, he was adamant about staying at my place. And my wife and I had a really small apartment in Sunnyvale, and I knew she wouldn't get Richard. So I said, Richard, we'll put you up in a hotel, He's such a funny guy. And then later on in the early 90s, Mark Wagner, who's a guy I worked with, we went to MIT to talk to him about something. I forget the details even, but he used to sleep in his office, on a little foam mattress, and then he'd go into the men's room and do whatever he was doing, brushing his teeth. He lived at MIT. He's such a character. And I think now he mainly is involved in politics, the politics of free software. And I don't really see that things have changed much since the Next days. Do you notice any change in the whole free software movement?
I don't think I would really be able to answer that question.
Oh. I mean, I respect it. He's still fighting the fight. But I don't know if you plan on asking about this, but another misconception is, I'll talk about that later.
Okay. Okay. Sure. Remind me if I don't end up asking what you think.
I'll remember.
Okay.
Yeah.
Was there any conflict over the fact that the Objective-C runtime was not open source or free software? Sorry, like the runtime was always proprietary.
It was. We documented the interface that the compiler depended on, and we felt that documenting that interface was our responsibility so that someone else in the free software world could write their own runtime, and other people did. Someone I hired as an intern, forget the exact year, but Creston Thorup was a Danish student who was just very talented. We hired him, and I believe he eventually contributed an Objective-C runtime. And again, Richard, I'm sure, wanted, but the runtime was a low-level piece of the operating system. And there were issues of the whole copyleft that if you link in this type of software into applications, which we were, or it was in our system libraries, would it infect the whole system? And our lawyers just didn't want to deal with that. So I think Steve and Next really did do more than any other company at its time, certainly more than Microsoft was doing at the time, with embracing in limited ways open source free software and the open source development model where you're collaborating with other people. And as you know, we followed through on that with LLVM and Clang, which we'll talk about later. And we did it with Safari, with WebKit. And there are lots of examples. I think Mach 2 was obviously taken from CMU, and I don't think that open source really flourished. I don't know. I think basically Next did have a lot of proprietary mods that never made it back to CMU. It's not my domain, but I do know that we dipped our toe pretty heavily, and I think deserve some credit for doing that, because Apple was, well, not Apple, Next. I think Steve thought that for the system plumbing and operating system and compilers, this was a very valid reason to leverage open source, because at the end of the day, they got an Objective-C compiler. And later on, they got an Objective-C++ compiler, which I did. So.
Well, actually, that's a good segue to talk about that. So why was it important to add C++ support to Objective-C?
So we had 3 big third-party software developers that were heavily into C++. We had Lotus, who were developing Improv. They were probably the most important. We had the Adobe team with Photoshop. They were big clients. And lastly, there was even some Pixar stuff on the radar screen that was being done in C++. 3 pretty important companies. And
one of which was owned by Steve.
Yeah. And Lotus in particular was really unhappy with what they had to do, which the workaround without what the work I did was to create a C function that they could call out, or in an Objective-C file, obviously, that would then call into the Objective-C kit to get their job done. Creating stubs for every interaction with the kit is very time consuming, right? And a maintenance burden. So it was immediately obvious to me that this needed to be solved, or else their lives would be miserable, and as a side effect, my life would be miserable, because I was, becoming the tools guy. And so Michael Tiemann had just I think it was '89, early '89, released the first GCC C++ compiler. Michael was a Stanford grad, and Michael Tiemann, John Gilmore, and David Henckels Wallace were starting Cygnus Software on University Ave. And I briefly touched base with Michael to get the lowdown on the state of the compiler. And he was pretty optimistic that though it wasn't finished, it was compiling quite a bit of stuff from the C++ perspective. So because he gave me enough positive feedback about his work, and again, I didn't really know Michael, but he seemed really smart, and I trusted him the little bit I knew him, I decided to try on a weekend hack to take his work and add my Objective-C work to it. And because same problem as I was discussing before, Stallman's C-based nodes weren't cutting it for C++. So Michael, it wasn't developed as an extensible toolkit. It was developed as a compiler. So then, Michael's parse tree mods and my parse tree mods would have to be reconciled. So that was part of the problem. So I got Michael's work in a weekend hack, got it pretty far, and was really pretty blown away that, the grammar was complaining about this, that, or the other thing, because compilers, when they're generating their tables and nodes, can detect ambiguities, and those ambiguities are sometimes pretty hard to discern, but I basically didn't let it bother me, and I just went heads down and continued. Long story short, after a couple weekend hackfests, because I didn't have time during my normal hours at Next to work on C++, got it far enough that I shipped I shipped Lotus, the compiler, and they were giddy that, oh my God, this is doing a lot of good for us, and please finish this. And that work ended up being used by them, and then the Photoshop team and Pixar, and it became really popular because people could, just like they bring over their C code and start using Objective-C immediately, if you view C++ as the next coming of C, then it makes total sense. Because what I wasn't doing, which some people initially thought could be the design point, is to merge the object models, right? Allow a C++ class to coexist with an Objective-C class. For example, that would allow potentially subclassing in Objective-C a C++ class. I thought that was just idiotic, and even if someone was lobbying hard for it, I would just say, listen, that's not the design point. It just doesn't make sense. Now, later on, it's interesting. People tried to make with SOM. There were other COM and SOM. There were other object models that tried to basically make C++ a little more dynamic. But I just never thought it made sense, unless C++ authors thought it made sense. So does that make sense, how that evolved?
Because the reason you didn't think it made sense is because C++ is fundamentally a static
Fundamentally
language.
C. It's just C. Yes, it's basically an improved structure, right? With the ability to add methods, but it is very static and not doing anything dynamically, and that would be a research project. That would be a research project. So, but one of the things, let's see, I wanted to, God, do I have it here? I'll find it.
But you just wanted to do the pragmatic thing to make.
I wanted to solve their problem.
Right.
Because really, solving the other problem was a tremendous effort. So, and it really made no sense. It really didn't make sense. So, wow, I could solve their problem in 2 weekends, get the compiler 80%, 85%, then finish it off. And eventually, Michael finished his work. We completed it, and it ended up being pretty robust. But even in the day, like what I'm trying to find here is, so here's like Lotus ships me a letter. They said, as a token of our appreciation for your efforts developing Objective-C++, been authorized to present you on behalf of the Lotus Back Bay team the coveted Code Talks Bullshit Walks t-shirt. Okay. The Objective-C++ compiler correctly compiles all our code, allows one to use all the features of both Objective-C and C++ in the same file, and was finished and delivered before we expected it. And they go on to say the Code Talk shirt is only given out when a team member has finished something before people thought anyone could have finished it, or has done something no one thought could be done, or in this case, both. So, it was just a really big deal to enable them. And Michael Tiemann's work, open source, wouldn't have been done without it. Imagine we were dealing with a proprietary C. Imagine we were dealing with AT&T. Would have never happened. So, I wish I could say in retrospect, we were all so brilliant that, all this great stuff, we're such great planners. There was so much serendipity here. We didn't control Michael Tiemann. He came out of the woodwork. And doing what he did is serious work. C++ is a serious language, and it takes a very special person to do what he did. And we leveraged it.
I think I wrote here somewhere that there were plans at one point to support Lisp in the runtime. Is that correct?
No.
No. Okay. So never. I thought I saw something about Franz Lisp in one of the documents you sent.
Oh wait. There was a time when Franz Lisp, they brought over their system and they wanted to interoperate with the runtime. That did happen, but that wasn't strategic. In other words, the Objective-C runtime is a library like any library, and if someone said, we want to be able to, I think we even did Objective Fortran, but we didn't do it. We just said, if you're a Fortran compiler writer and you want to send messages into the runtime, here's how you do it. Again, another beauty of dynamic, right? That if it wasn't dynamic and only the compiler was able to do the magic, then you couldn't easily do it. But most of these vendors have figured out how to call into C. It was a standard. So
earlier you mentioned Bertrand coming in. So you had helped hire Bertrand into Next, or were you?
I was part of the interview team, and was really impressed. And I wasn't I think I was managing a small team. It was me, Kevin Enderby, Matt Self on compiler, and Dave Moore, who's now a Google employee on the debugger. So we had a 4-person team. I think at the time I had started managing.
Oh, so you had officially become the dev tools team, the
Yes.
development tools team at that point?
Yes, I'd say by late 89, early 90, I was, I did that. I had taken over, and it's interesting. There was some discussions about in Next where to go with the tools, and Bertrand had written an email about really feeling strongly that the performance analysis tools were insufficient.
This is after he joined.
Yes. Right after he joined, he wrote an email in February of '89, which was sort of after, my first 6 months of being in the bomb run, when I was coming up for air, and he had been hired. And he had voiced some pretty strong opinions about his personal need for doing performance analysis. And he had done it in an email to, the software group. And it's interesting, I had replied to him and copied the same big cast of characters, still have this email, and I told him I agree G-Prof's totally inadequate, and I told him what I don't like about it, which confirmed what he didn't like about it. But I went on to say, we're in the bomb run for a release. We need to help you guys help yourselves, even if it's internal tools we develop. Having the tools team, given all the other stuff that was happening at the time, to sort of drop what we were doing and major in performance analysis tools was not what we needed to do. And I list 4 things that, let's see, was it 4? 5 things that we needed: a reliable debugger with a good interface. GDB wasn't cutting it. Debugging was more critical to people than performance analysis at that time. Plus, the operating system has more, a very unique set of performance problems, right? And so I went on to say dynamic loading is important. We need that. We need to upgrade to position-independent shared libraries. We need better browsers for development. You can't reuse something if you can't find it, and replace make that it's just not appropriate. And Steve Jobs read it and sent out immediately, I support your plan. And I think that's the time. I might have already been a manager, I forget, but it strengthened his belief that this is the right guy managing the team, because he's all about focus. So he was seeing in me, rather than get distracted, as long as you help the OS guys figure out their performance. So it wasn't like I was telling Bertrand, go away, we don't care about your performance problems. It's just that as the tools group, we have to distinguish between what we're doing for third parties and what we're doing for internal people. And so that's probably more than you asked for. But
No, that's good, because I was going to get to talking about more. Let's see. Yeah, and I was going to ask you about becoming a manager, which you touched on. Let's talk about maybe the development of the developer tools over time. You worked on things like the object browser, app inspector, process monitor, malloc debug.
the team did.
The team did.
Yes.
Right.
Yeah, Dave Moore was working on the debugger, and one of the things he did was integrate with Edit so that you can have the ability to browse the instances inline in the editor, some of that integration.
Right. So Edit was the text editor?
Yeah.
Right. So all the coding was done in Edit?
Yes.
Right.
So you code and Edit, and it was trying to bring some of the debugger niceties away from like having to go to a command line debugger and have a UI that is in the scope of the editor. That work was, when compared with IDEs that followed, was modest, but at the time it was really useful. I mean, when you have a 4-person team and you're in the bomb run for so many different things, we had to be modest. So I think a lot of those things were interesting for the time, but not maybe by today's standards. Some of that stuff might look pretty basic.
Well, I think it might be useful to sort of describe what it was like developing an app on Next Step at that point in time when there was no IDE yet? What were the set of tools that one was working with?
You know,
Was it mostly command line?
There some command. See, a lot of the internal developers, since they're OS people, were like, for instance, a lot of them like Emacs. So the benefit, if we were to wave a wand and have an integrated Xcode-like development environment in that point in time, interestingly, that wouldn't have been embraced by a lot of the OS guys because they liked Emacs. And, even though they acknowledge why an integrated development environment that doesn't depend on a command line is important from a higher level standpoint, that's not what they wanted. So there was always this tension between steps we can take to make internal people happy versus people who aren't internal, who don't have a deep Unix background, right? And that was true for so many years. It was a really tricky balancing act. Make too. Make's an example where it's a very file-based way of maintaining programs, but having a language-based way where if you have a function with 100 methods and only one changed, why should you have to compile all of them? Now, later on, we did lots of interesting work, some of which is patented with doing more incremental forms of compilation. But back in the next days, we didn't have the wherewithal because we didn't have the resources, and we were in the bomb run always. We were always. That's the one thing that was. It was good and bad. I mean, it was good in that our priorities were always not that difficult because she really didn't have that much freedom. So that's why I always would try and pick, let's take the last discussion about Objective-C++. That helped no one internally, right? So from the OS guy's perspective or other people's perspective, they're like, why are you guys working on that? Who cares about Adobe? Who cares about, right? So I was always the manager who had to have the thick skin to just lobby, here's why we're doing it, and we have 4 people. So, and lots of code to evolve and test and manage. So, what were the other tools you were talking about?
Process monitor, malloc debug, app inspector. I guess that's actually. I wanted to move to you mentioned Make. You developed something called DevKit.
Right.
Could you talk about that and explain what that is?
Yeah. So in 91-ish, 91 to 92, we had more breathing room because we had shipped lots of stuff, and we really felt like we could start innovating a little more. So one of the things we worked on was precompiled headers, because we had these kits with thousands of header files. And it made the compiler slow, and it made it impossible to find stuff, okay? So what other IDEs had done in the time, like Lightspeed C and Code Warrior, other compilers out there, is they had precompiled headers in a very limited form to make the compiler faster. And to be a little bit more specific, the C preprocessor is compiler writers' worst nightmare. The C preprocessor does arbitrary textual substitution. It gives you a level of flexibility to manipulate files that most people don't need, right? But because it's so powerful, it makes developing a feature like precompiled headers really difficult because some people can use this crazy stuff like, oh, if I'm in this context, define this structure. Or if I'm in this context, else define this structure with different structure bodies or fields, okay? Gives you some crazy capabilities. But we were the OS vendor. We owned our header files for the most part. We could place constraints on what those header files could contain. And we wanted to go further than other systems had gone and allow you to precompile your own headers, system headers, arbitrary, and we wanted our browsers to drive off the same database. So if you had a precompiled header for thousands of object definitions and method definitions, the human should be able to find that definition as fast as the compiler could find it. So I just love that idea. And I hired someone named Andy Lippman who worked on it with me. I did the dev kit work, which was a reusable parser that was independent of GCC. It was a full-fledged, yet another Objective-C parser, okay? But it had the property, when I call it reusable, it did not, by default, do anything but parse the program. Then you could add your semantic actions, and like if the semantic action was make the compiler faster, it would do one thing. If the semantic action was go find this in a header file because I'm a browser, a graphical browser, do another thing. And for its time, it was really an amazing idea, okay? And it was one of those things that I had written 3 or 4 compilers before that. So it was an evolution of, oh my God, I've written all this stuff. Let's factor out what's important. Yet another example of would I have ever, or people don't arrive at that because most people never get the opportunity to write 1 compiler, let alone 4, right? So, and in fact, that design I ended up implementing in Clang and LLVM later on, almost verbatim, because it was just right. You get to a point sometimes, and that's where getting back to IC packs, when you get to that point where something you've done it 4 times, and you know you're at a place where there's very little to wring out of it, improvement, that's when it's time to become a software IC, right, so to speak. So anyway, now back to, so we did that, and Header Viewer, which was an app I wrote that was on top of DevKit, was loved by people, and the precompiled header stuff worked great. And just there's a paper out there that I have that you could read that Andy wrote. He got it accepted by the ACM, and it was published. And it describes this, but I could describe it very quickly. It was a really cool idea where, let's say you have Hello World, calls printf, but you have an import or an include that includes thousands, tens of thousands of declarations. What this implementation would do is do a dependency graph of all the declarations you need to correctly compile that module, which in this case is, let's say, main printf. So it would just pluck out printf, put it, rather than put all the other system functions that surround printf, it would compute the fine-grained dependency graph. Like it would go to the function prototype, look at its arguments, unwind recursively, and figure out the complete fine-grained dependency graph and do it really fast. And it was really a really cool project. So DevKit enabled that. What was the other part of that?
No, I think
that was it? Okay.
Yeah, I think that's it. We're sort of working up to it, but I think the next thing I want to talk about is the creation of the IDE itself, Project Builder. How did that come about?
Dave Moore drove that. Dave was a really talented engineer who started working on GDB, and when he was able to dig himself out of fixing GDB bugs and getting GDB to work, he conceived of Project Builder along with obviously input from others, but he drove it and created it, and was really good at carving out enough that he can get it done in the release schedule we had. And like so many things we did, it was beautiful along some spectrum, but not complete along other spectrums. But I found when we went to like Next Developer conferences and other forums, I always felt like the developers were on our side and the developers were really happy with the choices we had made. You're always going to have some radicals who don't understand it's a 4-person, 5-person, I forget whether it was 4 or 5 people at the time. But in general, I think most people saw evolutionary progress from release to release and were really happy with what they were getting. Like we didn't have, for instance, at that time, like even though we had DevKit, we didn't have the support of doing code sense or like when you're in the editor to complete on methods. Right. You know, we could have had it if we had more resources, but doing that right is actually not trivial. It's not that hard from the language perspective, but making sure the UI is zippy and fresh. So we weren't getting a tremendous upheaval about code sense. Once later on, when it became a standard feature of Visual Studio, as time evolved and Microsoft was investing so much money in tools, then people started to compare with other development environments. But I think people said, oh, Interface Builder rocks, the language has been getting better every release, this header viewer thing's really cool, and integrated with RTF files, so the documentation was in rich text form. That too was pretty rare for the time period. So I think people felt like they were productive overall and weren't just measuring us by some industry standard yardstick. So I have nothing but, when I look back and let's say read appraisals of what I had done and some of my managers' feedback, you know, it was all, it seemed to all fit, you know, pretty well. And I really don't feel like through the next years there was any big discord about what was going on. The only problem I had was just we always seemed starved for resources because we were changing products and adding processors. And, you know, the other aspect of this is making sure that the compiler generates great code. You have companies like IBM that have like 200 people working on back ends. And, you know, we had one person, really half a person to focus on the back end. So we were somewhat dependent on the Free Software Foundation to make sure the back end was pretty good. And it was. I mean, when you have a portable compiler or a compiler that's being designed for many languages and many processors, there's always going to be some concession. But I always felt it was pretty good, and people would submit bugs, and sure, sometimes it would totally miss an optimization, and we would work with Richard and others and make sure it happened. I don't think code optimization was ever a roadblock. It was more the innovation we need to do with Objective-C. That was our baby, so we had to make it work. They weren't going to help us on that.
And Project Builder came out what year?
Oh, wow. I think it was 91. But I have documentation that will show when that is somewhere.
Okay. I want to go back to talking about a language feature, protocols. When did that come about, and how did that come about?
That came about to support a better IPC mechanism that was language-based. You know, I think Bertrand wanted better integration with Workspace and wanted other plugins and other apps to be able to message it. And that's what I recall the start was. So we had a feature called, we had forwarding, which people were using for doing prototypes of that. You could have like a remote object proxy which was a forwarding object, and then forward it on. And so the interesting thing, again, it gets back to dynamic. If you give people some of these hooks, you'll find some of these developers know you're busy, they have a need, so they find your hook to implement. So I think my recollection is that Bertrand did an early version of a proxy object that did message forwarding.
And this forwarding was a runtime feature, right?
Exactly.
Not a compiler
Not
feature.
a language
Right,
feature.
Right, not a language.
So then, and there will always be, even when you have compiler support, there will always be runtime support by its very nature, right? Because it's packaging up arguments and stuff. So he did that prototype, and then we talked about language support, and I forget, Blaine Garst hired on around that time, and Blaine was in the OS group, but had interest in this type, because let's face it, IPC is usually part of the OS group APIs. So it was an example where Blaine, Bertrand, and I all collaborated. In other words, Blaine didn't hack the compiler. He depended on me to do that. Blaine drew up the runtime requirements from a performance perspective, from an OS viewpoint, and Bertrand was giving us the app perspective. So again, this beautiful sort of collaboration that happened more than once, certainly at Next, but when it comes to protocols, I had then drawn up a proposal, which was very simple. Protocols are nothing more than a set of methods that have a name and represent some abstract set of behaviors that an object's going to implement. So subclassing at the time was starting to become passé. In other words, it started to become more known that having ornate, deep hierarchies really wasn't leading to the best result. But we found that if you can just describe what your requirements were in a protocol, and then your class object implements that protocol, it's really nice, right? It's liberating, because then the code isn't dependent on the class or the subclass. It's just very abstract, or provides an abstraction that people liked. So I think we also added qualifiers for identifying whether the parameter was an in, an out, or an in-out. There was some declarative compiler, keywords that expressed intent, right? So we also did that. And I don't know whether that was the first version or second, but in general, that's something C lacked. Like even if you pass a pointer, that pointer is passed by value, right? C++ has reference arguments where the reference is taken sort of automatically. But getting back to MAINSAIL, they had uses, produces, modifies, so you knew what the programmer's intent was. So we went a little bit more in that direction because the runtime benefited from knowing that. And the metadata was added. The one hiccup I recall with protocols is with a class, you had a clear home for the class. Like when you had a class implementation, there was a very obvious place to generate the metadata with the class. With protocols, we wanted metadata, but there is no good place to generate it. So I believe we used to generate them in all of the modules at first, if you use them, and then the linker would unique them. I then recall maybe later on we added a directive where you had to declare the protocols you use. And I don't know whether that was a requirement or not. It's back so far. I don't know, but you could understand the problem, which is it's abstract, it's in a header file, and we don't have metadata other than the precompiled headers, which aren't runtime savvy. more compile time and browser time. But you could imagine moving to a model where the runtime did access header files, but we weren't set up for that. One of the things Bertrand did, now that I think of it, that I don't know whether he solely did this, but I think he led it, was the substructure in the Unix file system to represent a framework. Like, we were using mock O files to cram a lot of stuff into. And
Mach-O is the executable format?
exactly.
Okay.
It's the executable format. It contains the data and the code, but it also contains the metadata. And we were also stuffing icons and other stuff in there.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, lots of stuff. And it was sort of like a poor man's file system.
Kind of like the resource fork on the Mac.
Exactly. Exactly. Same idea. And Bertrand came up with the bright idea of, let's stop shoehorning all this stuff into the executable file format, which I loved because I really didn't want to be in the file system business. So he developed like the dot framework directory structure with that had well-known directories in it that were the equivalent of a mock section and would contain stuff that had nothing to do with the code or data, like icons or like some other stuff. And that was really beautiful. I forget when that was done, and to this day, that's a big part of what's on Apple's operating system.
Going back to protocols, where did the idea come from? I think one of the documents mentioned like mix-ins that was in some other language. Was that an influence? What were the intellectual influences for protocols?
Wow, I don't. I mean, I'd like to say that some of it, or like to think that some of it might have come from MAINSAIL, but I don't think so. I mean, MAINSAIL was weird in that it had classes that only contained data, and you could have prefix classes and inherit the data, but you couldn't inherit methods. So I don't think it was MAINSAIL. I don't really did I say in the paper at all?
I don't remember. I think Blaine mentioned in his interview something about it coming from Modula from his perspective, but I don't know.
It would be interesting for us to pin that down because I don't remember. It's so simple that I don't even know if it has to. Oh, okay. So I do remember in C++, they had a notion of a pure virtual class, a class that was purely there to express interface, if I recall. So I actually, from my perspective, wouldn't be surprised. And that syntax they had, and at least in the day, it was sort of a feature which wasn't commonly used, but I thought was sort of cool in C++. So, there's part of me that thinks there was some inspiration from C++ there, but I'd have to look back in time.
I think one of the documents that you sent me, protocols is mentioned in a section where you talk about multiple inheritance.
Exactly. So now it's coming back. So I think we were always being asked for multiple inheritance in the large. And I never wanted to add it because, again, it for a dynamic runtime, it's particularly tough. And I think when I was looking at C++, I noticed you could multiply inherit a pure virtual class, and a light went on saying, wow, here they're using multiple inheritance just in an abstract way. That just seemed cool. So I don't know how many people were designing their class libraries with it, but I think a light went on for me. So I am now that it's paging back, I do think pure virtual classes in C++ were, because they had supported multiple inheritance, and we were being asked for it. So it was one of those things where I felt like I could sell it as a way to, and I actually now remember a presentation I did that is in the papers I uploaded, where I was selling it as certainly a solution to some of our RPC and remote message solution, but that it actively supported the multiple inheritance of interface as opposed to implementation. So while people might not have the full multiple inheritance that they're accustomed to, they do now have a linguistic way to declare it at least, and then they can implement it after the fact. And it seemed to strike a chord that it was a compromise that people could live with. Yeah, so I think Java was also influenced by that later on with interfaces.
Right.
I think they call them interfaces.
Yeah, they call them interfaces, yeah. Also, the original version of protocols only supported required methods in the protocol, or what they called formal protocols.
Right.
And not later on, there was this notion of informal protocols, which was really a category on the NS object.
Yes. Yes.
It was kind of a hack.
Yeah, I guess this is one area maybe I sympathize with C++ in that I felt like if you're adopting a protocol and you're a class and you really don't feel like implementing the 2 or 3 methods or however many methods it's describing, you should be required to provide a stub. I didn't think that was objectionable. Ali Ozer and his group didn't agree. That's my recollection.
Okay.
And so they encouraged us strongly to do something where it could be more informal. Yeah. Yeah. And they were our clients, so hey, fine. That's fine. That's part of the beauty. We weren't religious, and that's why I think in Brad, the talk or the interview you did with Brad, there was some assumption that, oh, you hired Steve Naroff. Yes, I like Steve Naroff, and he as a language designer, and it's, I think the word language designer came up somehow, and I'm not a language designer. I'm someone who has used a lot of tools, used a lot of languages, but saying any implication that I'm a language designer is overstating the case. I like to think I have good taste on some of this stuff and that I did some of the right things, but Bjorn's a language designer. And again, he's been criticized plenty for C++. So just because you're a language designer doesn't mean people aren't going to have opinions.
Right. Let's take a little step back and talk about the culture of Next in the early years. What was that like?
In the early years, and I'd say through the entire time was pretty consistent. One of the things I have here, which is kind of interesting, is Steve handed out when we first, like the first year I had gotten there, it was something they handed out, mission, build computers to change the world, and our friends can afford. It's kind of interesting because most of my friends couldn't afford the original Next Cube. But it was a good goal.
It was an aspiration
right,
that was
aspirational.
Not met.
Lead the industry in vision and innovation, great. Build a company so exciting and fulfilling that we can't wait to get to work in the morning. Treat our customers so well that they love our products and company. And communicate openly, honestly, and respectfully. And one of the things I highlighted here, facts are friendly. Fear of shooting the messenger zaps our ability to perform and improve. We must continuously strengthen our commitment to management by fact and respect for each individual and encourage the free flow of information up, down, and across the company. And lastly, raise the bar. But, it's interesting then, I don't know if Steve wrote all that. Chances are he didn't, but I know he believed in it and blessed it. And I really think the free flow of information, the don't shoot the messenger, that was really true for all the years I was there, from 88 to 94 roughly. So for 6 years, I was fortunate to work in an environment that was free of the usual BS that you have to deal with in companies where there are weird politics, weird turf wars. We had none of that. That I'm conscious of. I'm sure there are other people in the company that might feel differently, but I think most people considered it to be an amazing culture where people were allowed to just do the right thing. Now, the open salary and stock thing that I briefly mentioned, that ended after I think the company grew to 200, which was probably around 1990, that was discontinued. I started in 88, maybe a little bit before 90 it was discontinued. Just because when you grow to 200, I think it was still the right idea, but it's harder to manage. The fact that it lasted for 2 years, I think was still commendable to run a company like that. But other things about the culture, I mean, Steve, in The Lost Interview, which I'm sure you've seen or are familiar with, it's a great interview with Cringely. Steve talks about his early days of going to HP with the donut cart and how they took care of their people with things like that. We had the juice bar there, and all that was new to me. I mean, Silicon Valley now has free tons of stuff, massage, and there's all kinds of stuff people get now. But in those days, just giving people free juice was like a big thing, right? And we had, cooks that would come in and cook for us. And we had actually an off-site that happened about 4 or 5 months after I started. Right after the intro, Steve took us to a retreat in the Santa Cruz Mountains.
After the cube shipped?
Yeah. And it was at a place called Chaminade. And Bertrand and I actually shared a room. We were all, and it was very cool. And I actually found the agenda from it and uploaded it. And it was very cool to remind myself that each day there was, in the evening, time for a jam session where, where people who played instruments could play. And because Bud Tribble was actually a great pianist. I think I broke out my sax briefly. And actually, when I first got to Next in Deer Creek, there was a music room for the musicians, and there were some really crazy-looking speakers, and I asked about them. And there was a Bosendorfer piano, just a beautiful piano. And someone just said casually, "Oh yeah, those are the Grateful Deads. I guess Steve got them from the Dead." I'm like, this is just too cool, right? To have a music room with some of the Dead's audio equipment and piano, and a piano. I don't know if. So that was fun. It was just a fun group of people. And Chaminade, too, the other thing that was a little bit mind-blowing for me at the time is we had these dinners with unlimited lobster tails, and that just seemed, again, I grew up pretty modestly, but to be able to have as many lobster tails as you want, and it was really good lobster. So that was also a little bit extreme. But one of the other things on a slightly, less upbeat tone, but give you some visibility into Steve is, during the first Chaminade, sort of where Steve was giving his first pitch the first day, one of the females, and I forget her name or don't even remember who it is actually, was taking notes on her computer, and Steve asked her to close the computer and said very sternly, if you're not smart enough to remember what I'm talking about, then you have no business being here.
Wow.
Yeah. So, it set a tone. And, it, as harsh as something like that is, and I've had him say, which we'll probably get to later, some stuff to me that was of that ilk. Even when, you know what I learned? I learned that when he sent that type of message, he actually was usually right. It's just embarrassing to have it be said as directly and as bluntly as he said it. So, it was shocking when that happened, and I'm sure the person who it was said to, and I don't even remember whether he actually said it directly to her and was trying to really attack her, or said it a little bit more generally and she got the idea, or I don't even remember those details, and to some degree they're not important, but it was, part of his management style. Be direct. And, yeah, so.
What was diversity like at Next?
It wasn't in engineering, it wasn't a very diverse, place. But that was partly because in those days, it was hard enough to find people that did what we did. And, for instance, if I wanted to hire a female compiler person, good luck. They just didn't exist. So I think that's changing. I imagine it's changing, where more females are going into computer science. I don't know what the data is, but I think to some degree it wasn't great, and it was, and I'm not trying to let Next off the hook. I mean, I think all companies need to take some responsibility for it, but I do think that, I know me personally, if I had a resume of a female, it was treated equally, and it just, I didn't see many resumes in the tools area for females. And, I know there are some people who, that's such BS, Again, you have to have the data. You have to be armed with the data to really argue with me on that. I know it's totally unrelated, but I go to jazz concerts a lot. It's 80 to 90% male. Why is it? I don't know. Maybe females don't like listening to instrumental jazz. They like vocals. I don't know. But some things, or pinball. Pinball's very male dominated too. Still a hobby of mine. So there are certain areas where it's not that there isn't a place for females, but they aren't gravitating there often. So,
is there a cultural reason? I mean, are there some, some of the explanations for these are that some cultures are male dominated or are maybe hostile to women entering. You mentioned jazz. You mentioned, these, it could.
Well, I know jazz isn't hostile to women. And that's why I like to bring it up, because it's benign, right? It's entertainment,
right.
And it's interesting. Like the clubs I go to in LA, the females that usually do show up are of Asian descent, and a lot of times that's because Asia is just more plugged into jazz than this country is at the moment. So sometimes it's the culture, right, these people are coming from. Right. So as for why our culture, at the time I was working at Next in the late 80s, early 90s, why females weren't gravitating towards that, I don't have any great insight into. There's no doubt that there's a cultural personality, there's a personality type that's going to do well in a Steve Jobs culture. And just like what I just said, you have to have some thick skin to deal with some of the antics. Just like I, to pass the interview, had to defend myself. There's an element of that, and maybe some females aren't as comfortable dealing in that. But what I'm saying is many females didn't get up to bat, right? We didn't interview that many females in those days.
But do you think that the culture of engineering itself, was that conducive to women coming in, or did were there a lot of women, of the women that were in engineering, did they feel comfortable, or did they feel like
I think so.
Did they fit into
I think so. We had someone named Kate. I forget her name. She was working in the digital librarian group. And I think I ran into her at one of the next gatherings. I believe she felt Next was as great a place as any of the males there. So, and Kathy Novak was a documentation person. I worked closely with Kathy. She loved it there. So I do feel the females that were there did really enjoy the culture as well. I mean, I know they're just like the males. You've heard of the Steve Jobs hero shithead roller coaster. Well, if the males are on that roller coaster, chances are the females are, and whether they react the same way as males do, I don't know. I guess it depends on the person. I mean, I can have a thin skin sometimes. I mean, actually, an email I wanted to read you before that Steve wrote me. I was disappointed that when Steve demoed the Lotus software, which depended on Objective-C++, all that stuff, I was disappointed that he didn't give my team credit, because we did it in our spare time. We finished it. They loved it. And I had gotten kudos from Lotus. So I just wanted our leader in the public setting when he was demoing improv, this is just internal to the company, to give us a shout out. But he didn't. And so he wrote, and I told him in an email that I was unhappy with that. I won't read you my email because it's not that exciting. But his says, I think you were being a little thin-skinned here. The reason we are doing C++ is to ensure the success of our computer, and therefore the success of the main mission of your group, Objective-C. Going to the restroom also helps the success of your group, but we don't recognize you for that either. I think that you, as the group leader, need to keep the vision of Objective-C alive within your group and Next, and treat C++ as a necessary task to ensure that our main vision thrives. So, there's an example where I know he loved the work that was done, but because I'm holding him to a standard, he's unhappy with me holding him to that standard. But Steve Jobs was the type of guy that, even though he's given it to me a little bit there, he fundamentally knows leaders have to have empathy for their team. And believe me, he respected me more. So I was fine taking the shot, because I know that he stored this away as he was wrong.
I see.
In other words, he defended himself by telling me, well, every time you go to the bathroom, I don't thank you. But the reason he did that is he felt guilty. That's his way.
Interesting.
Of mea culpa.
I've never heard that before.
That's why I told the story.
Yeah.
And it's funny, I've saved very few emails, but I saved that one because it said more about him than it did me.
Interesting.
And yet, he's trying to make me feel bad. Right. Like, you're thin-skinned. God, you go to the bathroom. What's up? And I don't think I was being thin-skinned, and I don't think he really thought I was being thin-skinned. I think he felt bad. But that's a type of relationship that was complex to understand sometimes. And some people, after getting his response, I'd say probably a lot of people would say, God, I shouldn't have sent that, right? I don't want Steve to think I'm thin-skinned. I want him to think I'm a tough guy. No, I was totally behind that email and had no problem with his response.
So you owned it.
Totally owned it. There was no reason not to own it. Listen, there are other things. I played my Steve Jobs email cards very carefully. There are definitely, I could have imagined sending him emails where he would have been totally right. Man, I'm being thin-skinned. I'm a jerk. I'm expecting too much from you. But not this one. This one enabled major third-party vendors. This had an impact on the sales of our computer. And how often do people who work on plumbing and compilers have an effect like that? And all you did was have to thank the 4-person team, because there were debugger things. I mean, it wasn't just me. Right. I wanted it for the team. I had already been thanked, so it wasn't about me. And he understands leadership, and he understands selflessness and again, empathy. And I think he was just unwilling to admit I was right. He wasn't in the mood to say, you're right, I'm sorry. So.
Interesting. Could you talk about what it was like when Next had to stop making hardware? How difficult was that?
It was very difficult. I mean, I felt like so much of the sizzle with Next was surrounding the industrial design, the manufacturing, and just the whole shtick about developing computers for our friends, having a workstation, the power of the sun with the UI of a Mac. And it never became affordable for friends. And I think Steve's heart was in the right place. I think the company's heart was in the right place. And we just didn't succeed at that. Well, obviously, we had to get out of the business. So it was bad. I guess Next got out in 92? Is that when it was?
I think yeah.
Late 92?
Something like that, yeah.
So I was, as you can imagine, fairly tired after all this bootstrapping of Next and all this work. And we, as I discussed before, had a failed pregnancy in '88. And my wife, we wanted to try again. And we actually had our first child in '94. But in '92, we were starting to think about it, starting a family. And I, just like the moment when Cericor was bought by HP and I started thinking about other opportunities, when Next got out of the hardware business, it was kind of similar. For me, it was, wow, I've put in some tough 4 years. It was 92, and I need to start thinking about the future because I don't see Next making it as a software-only company. And one of the things we did around that time frame, Steve organized a trip to talk to Bill Gates and his guys up at Microsoft because we were now on Microsoft's turf, right? And so we went up to try and sell them on modifying Visual Studio to work with Objective-C better. We were also selling them on some other stuff, and I don't really recall all the details, but it was a contingent of Paul Hegarty, who was running software at the time, myself, I believe Avi was there, and Steve. So we went up to Microsoft, met with them, and it was an okay meeting. I mean, to be honest, I don't remember much about the meeting. I remember more about an interesting, like we got to the airport and we rented a minivan and it was a Ford Windstar, okay? And Steve said, I'm driving, okay? And Steve's driving this Ford Windstar and he's bitching and moaning. And I'm like, about it. I'm like, Steve, it's not a Mercedes, okay? It's not a sports car. Calm down. And he said something like, what kind of idiot would ever buy a car like this, you know? And my wife and I had just bought a Ford Windstar. And I didn't tell Steve that. That's one thing I didn't disclose, right? And so I remember, but again, it's just so funny. I mean, he's treating this thing like a sports car because, you know, all he ever owned was silver Mercedes, sports coupes or something. But so it was a fun trip, but it was more evidence that, man, we're on their turf now, and it's going to be tough. I mean, Win32 programming was just an abomination. God, it was just awful. I can't imagine programming in that environment. But all their people were accustomed to it. So I know we had better tools. I know it would have been great to work with them. But, you know, they were the 10,000-pound gorilla, and we were just a small software shop at the time. And believe me, they didn't want to become dependent on us. So I think they might have thrown us a couple bones, but there was very little synergy, real synergy with them. So the companies I interviewed at around that time period was First Person, that was doing Java, spin-off of Sun, and actually Apple, the research group in Massachusetts.
Oh, right, the ATG. They were doing Dylan.
They were doing Dylan.
Right.
So
another dynamic language.
Exactly. And, you know, since I had some visibility in the community for being the person behind some of this Objective-C stuff and Next technology, there, you know, I had lots of opportunities. And several principal Next people went over to First Person. Mike Damoni, the guy who originally hired me, went there. And him and Peter King were there, I believe, and they were talking me up. And had a great interview with Gosling. He's such a nice guy, and he's such a bright guy and a humble guy. And I really wanted to work there with him on one level. On the other level, I didn't want to just follow my Next colleagues, and I really didn't feel Sun was totally behind it. I felt like they spun First Person off, and it wasn't firing on all cylinders, because you may remember, First Person was tasked with making software for like almost embedded devices. The web browser angle was nowhere to be found at that time, right? So I was skeptical that was going to be successful, though it looked like a cool language, and they were very loving of Objective-C, and you know, so it felt like an interesting progression, but I didn't end up. I was offered a position and didn't take it, and decided to hang it Next a little bit longer, and also did the interview with Ike Nassi, who was running a chunk of Apple software for a while. And they, too, had amazing people. Mike Kahl, who was the author of Lightspeed C, which was a great product, and he's just a great guy. David Moon, who was one of the fathers of Garbage Collection. Andrew Shallett was there. They had a wonderful team. They were a research group, and their product did not hit the milestones necessary for Newton, and then they had no clients, and they were looking to bring me in to help solve that. It was mission impossible. And so I pretty much thought that they were going to close that shop down. Like if I moved to Boston, I was convinced a year later I'd be moving to Cupertino, and that happened. So I held tight, and then became pretty interested in Taligent. And rather than work at Taligent, I decided to work at the mothership, and so I took a job with IBM in North Carolina, where a lot of the leaders and management are located. The attraction was get out of the rat race of Silicon Valley. The cost of living there was much improved. We had a very modest place, just to give you an idea, a modest place in Fremont next to a train. And for the same price of that very modest house, got a beautiful house on a golf course in North Carolina. And I took a job as an IBMer. And when I left, Steve said, "You're not going to be happy. I know you. It's not the right place for you, but go do what you got to do. It's probably a sabbatical." And he ended up being right. I lasted 9 months there.
So you were working on Visual Age C++ there?
I was helping. I was helping their management, upper management, understand whether Visual Age and other initiatives, OpenDoc, Taligent, whether these efforts were going to bear fruit.
So you're almost in a consulting role.
Yep, I was working for a guy named Rod Smith, who's just a wonderful, he's a fellow at IBM. I love Rod, great guy. I actually, just all the people at IBM, just good, high integrity people. So it had nothing to do with the people or the well, the cultural aspect was I wasn't really comfortable being an outbound mole who shook hands a lot. I mean, really what they wanted me to do is get in the trenches and find out stuff that in a sane world they would be figuring out, which is, someone basic thing is, well, aren't you guys using Taligent? You want to ship it a year from now, but no one's running it. So there were so many basic aspects of software engineering that they were missing. Eating your own dog food, using your own software. Why would you hire someone to tell you whether something is useful? But it's big company stuff, right? So, Taligent they defunded, OS2 they defunded, OpenDoc went away. So many things went away. That happened after I left, and I'm not trying to say in any way I was responsible for decommissioning any of that. But that's part of why I left, is because one of the things I don't like about management is firing people or canceling projects. It's not fun.
What was it about Taligent that initially drew you to it, and how do you compare it to Next Step? I can't compare it to Next Step. I know that they were, at some level, very fond of Next Step, but they tried hard not to copy it. And let's face it, they were in C++, so at least from a linguistic perspective, we knew they weren't going to copy it. But the thing, they were naive about building a system of the scope they were building in C++. They got bitten by the same bug that bit HP with Cericor. Same exact bug, even though it was years later. C++, they realized they had to actually control the compiler and the code gen to evolve it with their system.
like we were doing with Objective-C, but C++ was a much bigger bear to wrestle than Objective-C. One of the, and we didn't talk about this before, but an important point that I always love to make is keeping the language simple has two values. One is people looking to use your libraries only have to learn a small set of programming idioms. Number two is the programming team, when you have a problem, the surface area of what can go wrong is far less than with C++. C++ is such a complex language that if unbounded in what people are allowed to use, the nooks and crannies can drive, people crazy. Especially compiler writers. And so they were stumbling on performance. Very interesting, right? People were dinging us for, oh, it's dynamic, it can't perform. They realized that when virtual tables get too big and that you have lots and lots of composite subclassing with many levels, that the implementation wasn't up to what they had imagined. They're very bright people. They did a lot of good work. But aside from infrastructure problems, they were also just not eating their own dog food. They had IBM and Apple directing them. And when you have two big companies that are directing something, but neither company is running that software on a daily basis, it's a joke. It's just, so I felt like, okay, I'm at IBM. It's so easy to see the problems. Why am I even being paid? If I were a different type of person and was really ready for retirement, I could have said, let me just kick back, shake hands. I was so accustomed to building stuff and feeling good about it that just playing this weird sort of techno-politics was, Steve knew I was just plus, so many of these people were running green screen, mainframe-based emails. Like I went from Next, rich text, Steve called it interpersonal computing, so the precursor to what we have today with the web, to going to IBM and having to send emails in green screen, sort of text only, and it drove me crazy. In fact, I have a couple emails that I saved from when I was leaving from IBMers, and it's in that mainframe format, really, and so it's tough to take a company with their background and culture and modernize. So yeah, they tried to modernize by funding Taligent, and it just wasn't happening. But to get back to part of your question, there was a guy named Eric Gamma who was there, who was one of their principal architects, who I had immense respect for.
He's one of the Gang of Four, right? Who wrote the design patterns book?
Got it, yeah. Yeah, I was a big fan of that book and thought the world of Eric. And I believe tried to hire him at Next. And Eric, I just thought Eric was going to figure out, along with other Erics at Taligent, how to, make it successful. I didn't realize until I was on the inside how off the tracks it really was, though technically their hearts were all in the right place. And I think there was a lot of over-engineering going on. And when you don't have people using your software, you are evolving it in arbitrary technical directions that may or may not become fruitful. So they just weren't driving it in a sensible fashion. And that's getting back to culture. It wasn't about technical prowess. I'm convinced Taligent had as many smart people as Next did. and I bet some could argue smarter in many regards. But one of the brilliant quotes from Alan Kay in one of the things I read recently was, perspective is equivalent to 80 IQ points, right?
Or point of view, I think.
Point of view.
Yeah.
There we go. So, okay. Similar perspective, point of view, but okay, point of view. And I think Next had that in spades. And it had it because it was, the sum is greater than the parts type of thing, and the collaborative nature of the culture, and the fact that everyone, Steve included, was always using stuff. Like, actually, one of the tools my group did that a guy named Mark Wagner, who's now at Microsoft, when I left, Mark took over the team. We used to have weekend hack, I forget what they called them, or maybe it was a day thing, or I don't know, was it 1 day, 2 day, or 3 day, but basically use the APIs, the kits, and develop an application. And Mark developed this really cool side-by-side differencing program. And one of the coolest aspects is when you scrolled, they would synchronize, right? And he did a wonderful job on that. And I brought Steve in, and Steve was blown away. Steve's like, oh my God, lawyers could use this. And he just saw so many applications other than programming tools, because this was basically a better graphical diff. And that became part of actually Project Builder and the editor eventually. We integrated it side by side, scrolling and differencing. But there's an example where, Steve, as soon as he saw that, supported it, used it, drove it, and he used everything we were doing, and that makes a huge difference.
So then you decided to leave IBM and go back to Next in '95?
Yeah. Java was starting to get a lot of attention, and so my pitch to folks at Next, I forget if I called Steve or not, but I basically said, listen, I'm thinking of leaving IBM. I don't want to move back to the Valley because we just had my son Dylan, or we're about to have my son Dylan. I think we just had him. And I'm happy with where my family is now. I get to see my relatives in New York and Florida. But I'm willing to work on Java remotely because I think you guys would benefit from having a Java strategy now that you're a software company. And I pitched like Java Bridge stuff, just porting the VM. So they're like, yeah, great. Because, it wasn't easy to find people to port VMs and do this type of work. So I did it remotely and would go back and forth from Redwood City, which is where I guess they were still based. Yeah, Redwood City.
When did they move to Redwood City?
That happened, I think Redwood City was 90? Yeah, 90. Yeah. And I got to work on the Java language spec with Gosling a bit, and my was listed as one of the reviewers, and it was a happy time. I got to be involved in Java, but that's how I ended up working on Java, just at a different place from a different perspective and contributing a little bit. But for me, porting the VM to Mach was a fun project, so I did that, and then worked on the Java Bridge so that you could call Java from Java, interact with our kits and that kind of stuff.
So, so you had, obviously, because you had interviewed at First Person before, you had already been, you had already been exposed to Java. Why did you think that Java was important to Next in particular, and why were you excited about Java?
I think as a hardware vendor and an OS vendor, peddling your own language is a small incremental thing to foist upon people who are betting their business on you. Take away the hardware, take away the OS, all of a sudden the language is a bigger deal, right? It's more of an obstacle. So I actually felt strongly, even though I was Mr. Objective-C, that as a standalone software company, Objective-C shouldn't be part of the strategy. I know that sounds radical, but I really felt that way. And it was one of those, again, it's the real non-religious side of me that said, listen, so many people that had, so much built up in a particular technology, because I had 5 or 6 years of my life built up, an awful lot of people would have tried really hard to ignore the business issues. But Steve really respected my honesty, and that was part of why Steve and I never had big problems, is because when he asked me a question, he asked me how important I thought Java was going to be. And from my perspective, I thought it was going to be really important. And so, listen, I knew that we were not going to rewrite all that code in Java. I'm not naive. However, if the bindings were good enough, then for all intents and purposes, people wouldn't know what's under the covers. I mean, Java supported native methods as it is. So the fact is, it's just a kit with Java with tons of native methods implemented by Objective-C. So I just thought that was the future if Next was going to stick or stay as a software-only company. Yeah, so, it was always a balancing act because I tried to promote Java as best I could without being anti-Objective-C, so I had to, and because, you don't want to scare everyone at the company.
Right.
They had already gone through some trauma with not supporting hardware. Mm-hmm. So I was enough embedded in the culture that people trusted me to do the right thing in this area. If they would have if what I was trying to do was being done by someone that was new to the company, it probably would have been met with more resistance from Ali Ozier and the other guys. Right. So that's why they took me back so quick. Right. It's also interesting that, at least from my perspective, Steve Jobs was extremely loyal to me throughout. There are many CEOs that would never take you back after leaving them at such a critical point. But he was totally human about it and totally understood what I had been through, and by virtue of saying, well, worst case, it's a sabbatical. And I really didn't plan that. I'm not that type of person. It's not like I was looking at IBM as a sabbatical. Again, they're great people, and it's a great company. It's just a big company that had a culture that was shocking to me. And I was very honest with the IBMers when I was leaving. I liked all of them, but they knew the culture was what it was. I mean, they had 200 people in Toronto working on compiler backends. 200. That was, I had my 4 to 6 person compiler team that did debuggers, and so it's a world that I didn't get. There was lots and lots of legacy. I mean, back when they were doing Fortran, and Fortran was the cash cow on their mainframes, they could afford to have 200 people working on the back end. And let's face it, they still have cash cows. So who am I to question where they're spending their money? But the amount of money being wasted was silly. I mean, just think about the sum of OS2, Taligent, OpenDoc. Crazy. That's a big number. which is part of what I find interesting about the industry, and another area I've been so lucky. Almost all the software I've worked on has been used by real people, for real things. And man, that's a real blessing, for lack of a better word, because so many people work on software that never really blossoms. I mean, OS2 did have its day, but it sort of had a horrible death too. And OpenDoc never really had its day. Intelligent never had its day. As you know, that's part of why Apple ended up buying Next, is they were unsuccessful at doing an operating system on their own. And they ran into the same problem that so many big companies run into is, oh, well, this is such a hard problem. Why don't we partner with another really big company so it can be even bigger problem? Because really, I mean, but so many people are driven by building empires. So.
I want to talk a little bit more about the Java Bridge and that work. I think one of the documents you sent was saying that like the Java Bridge was a separate strategy than the Java VM. They were like competing strategies or something. Is that correct, or were they complementary?
Complementary.
They were complementary. Okay. But the bridge solution is it's a conservative solution, right? It's not like you touched on that. It's not like you're ripping out Objective-C. It's just sort of a way for Java to interact with the existing Objective-C frameworks.
Right. It's a way to allow Java native, sort of pure Java that has no relation to the app kit to coexist with Java wrappers that plug into the app kit. So in a way, it's a little bit similar to the Objective-C++ solution in that what it isn't is, like for example, it supports composite object work, where you have a Java object that's written, again, in pure Java, no native code, and it's calling out to, let's say, UI elements that are native Objective-C. That's different from subclassing, right? It just has a handle to that. Right. The object models are more integrated than C++, because Java, under the covers, the Java wrappers, even though the bridge has some magic in it, the Java had the native method facility for us to plug into, right? Because Java being a distinct language from C, they knew they had to plug in to C code, which that's what the native support is. So we're just, leveraging that. Oh, okay. There's no way in those days or even today, I mean, let's face it, if you're a new language, you do need a way to call C usually. Mm-hmm. If your operating system's written in C. So that's the level of integration as opposed to a totally unified model. Obviously, it's not like their swing and our app kit are just totally distinct. Right. You wouldn't be taking a swing object and having tight integration. That would be totally separate. Either you're doing your UI in Swing or you're doing it in Cocoa, but you'd use your higher level or lower level objects to work with either of those libraries.
Right, I see. Yeah. And was it a good match? Java, there are some similarities between the two languages. You mentioned that a lot of the Next people had gone over to first person.
Right.
The interfaces feature is very similar to the protocols feature. I guess there is a dynamic runtime, but Java is also a statically typed language, I guess.
Java is more statically typed. Java had no notion of ID. Like, as you know, in Objective-C, the only data type it originally supported was ID. Then we added static typing. Still dynamic binding, but static typing. And Java pretty much only has static typing. There's no way to say, give me a reference to any object in any hierarchy. But if I recall, because again, I've been out of it for a while, Java was single inheritance, right? And also with a single sort of omniscient root object. I don't think it was like hardwired into the language, but Java lang object was equivalent to our NS object. So even at that architectural level, they were pretty similar. So the good news there is people learning Java, when they learn our kits, they're going to see some similarities, right? And so that's the win there. It's not, whereas with C++, right? If someone vends, C++ has so many features. And if you're using it in an unbounded fashion, that would really be a wrench in the works for if you're coming from another language. So I think just there was a good match between Objective-C and Java just at a teaching level, right. which means a lot. Right. At the time, Java's implementation is more dynamic than Objective-C, but Objective-C, by some definition, is a more dynamic language, even though it's more compiled, right? Java was totally interpreted. In fact, one of my problems with Sun and Java, which we may talk about as we move on in the talk, is, later on when Apple was doing stuff with Java, and I wanted more of a native compiled Java for the operating system, Sun wasn't really a fan of that. So.
Right. All right, so we were talking about Java at Next. So at this point, Next is working on web objects, right? And that's like their major push.
Yes.
And so you're pushing for web objects to be a Java interface to web objects.
Absolutely.
So how far did that get while you were at Next? Was that actually done while you were at Next?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, it was done, and I think it shipped. Pretty sure it shipped.
Okay. How well was the Java work received at Next? It seems like, well, I guess the web objects version shipped, so it seems like it was fairly well received.
Well, I think the people that would probably be more vocal is the people who are using web objects, right? And I don't have vivid memories of that. I believe it all went well. Yeah, so I think at the time they were pretty much pitching programming in Java when you're using web objects. And
so a lot of that came from the users that they wanted to use Java.
Yeah, I mean, it's an easier sales pitch to say use our web objects infrastructure, and you could do it from the language you're currently learning, whether it's in a university or elsewhere, because Java was starting to really catch fire. A lot of people were learning Java, and at the time, as you know, I forget exactly when Swing was released, but even AWT in the browser, as lackluster as that AWT was, it was still exciting people because it was, wow, I could run my code in the browser, right? So there was a lot of excitement, and Java was getting a lot of mind share. Do you remember?
Yes.
Yeah, yeah.
I was in college at that point, so I
Yeah,
remember
and
that transition.
Even Doug Lee at Oswego, I mean, he was writing books on C++. He started retargeting a lot of his books and thinking to Java. So even at little old Oswego, they were globbing onto Java too. And I don't know how much it's taught now or how much it was ever taught, but it was really popular. And I think we've talked offline. I think this is probably the time period. Maybe it was before. I don't know what the time period was, but I had said to Steve, is Objective-C part of our problem in terms of adoption, API adoption, whatever? And he said, no, I don't think so. Our problem is we're not selling enough computers. So I guess it was right before we got out of the hardware business. But even later on at Apple, Steve was still a believer in Objective-C, and he just felt as a leader that, it's his problem to sell more machines, devices, and when that happens, Objective-C will be used like we would like. And that the programming languages are much more about reach of developers, which makes total sense. It makes total sense. And it describes why most programming languages don't make it, because it usually has to be bundled with a bigger revolution, so to speak. So Java's revolution was the browser. And as you know, things changed, and Java had an interesting journey, some of which we'll get into, I guess. But yeah, everyone thought it was going to take over the world, and everything applets would take over the world, right? And that didn't happen. So.
Well, let's get to the Apple transition then. So, what was that like when you found out that Apple was acquiring Next?
It's interesting because one of my visits when I was doing the Java work, I was upstairs where Steve's office was, and I saw Michael Spindler in his office. And it looked like a really serious, and this was before.
So Spindler was still the CEO of Apple at that point. So that was pre-Gil Amelio.
Yeah. Yeah, and it looked like a really serious discussion. And Spindler looked all stressed out. And I just remember, and I just noticed it, and then sort of put it in the back of my mind. I mean, I actually, at that time, didn't realize that there were very serious talks going on, but then put two and two together. But when it actually got released, it was wonderful news. I mean, it was an absolute perfect ending to what we had done at Next, because we knew that the software was good stuff, and it just needed a hardware platform to be successful. And Apple was absolutely fledgling, and none of us were, I think, bold enough to think that we were going to solve all of Apple's problems. I think just the opposite. I probably thought, wow, that's great, but wow, this is going to be an interesting ride, and let's see, what else about that time period? Well, I mean, I was still working remotely. I was still in North Carolina, and I think Steve had called the house, and my mother-in-law picked up and said, Steve Jobs is on the phone. I'm like, Steve, he never, he's not that type of person to call on my home phone. And he said, and I do think, no, this was after the news, yes. So it was after I already knew it was being sold. And he said, listen, we're deciding what the management structure is going to be. That's right. It was like maybe 4 to 5 months after. And he said, Avi and I want you to come back and run the tools team for us. And it was a tough one because we really did like raising a family in a more humane cost of living area. You know, the next stock I had was certainly a nice bonus from the sale, but it wasn't enough to retire on. And so I basically made a decision to go follow, I guess, my heart and just go out there again. And Steve Van Avi made me a great offer and to do that. And they were... what was I going to say about Steve? Oh, they were just great about the whole transition. But I know what I want to say. I knew nothing about their strategy about bringing the company back. And soon after I accepted and arrived in Cupertino for like the first meetings, Steve started talking about the colored iMacs. And it's funny, the technologist in me said, "Oh my God, I just moved cross country." And now, again, it was a good offer, but I'm moving back for colored, to make colored computers, thinking this is going to be, the solution to Apple's problems. And, it just goes to show that while that may have been a valid thought, that I wasn't seeing the big picture, because Steve was a showman. Steve was going to put a stake in the ground. That here's some pizzazz. It was still Mac OS 8, had nothing to do with anything at Next. So it was purely a hardware play because we were trying to figure out how we were going to merge the software, how were we going to evolve. So Next stuff was really nowhere to be seen. So that's another reason. It's like, okay, they're not really using our software yet. That's going to be a hard road to hoe and color computers. But, he ended up being right, and he knows way more than I do about what the masses are going to, what he could sell them. He was brilliant at that. He was the best at knowing what the market wanted, and his talks were always spot on. And so it's good that I didn't know, because honestly, I could have done something stupid and said, "Oh my God, that sounds stupid. I'm just staying put. I'll go back to IBM." Could have done that. I could have said, I could have gone with my tail between my legs to the folks at IBM and said, I'm not so sure this next acquisition is going to be right, so why don't I continue working on whatever you guys want? Because I knew that IBM would have a great pen. There's so many other perks working for IBM, and it was unclear whether Apple was going to fly with Next. Plus, it was sort of unclear what Steve's role would be. It was just, is it going to be more politics? Is he really going to have the freedom to do what he wants? So many unknowns. But as you know, it all worked out in the end. There's no doubt, though, that merging the Next team tools guys with the Apple tools guys, part of the really difficult part of my tenure there. It was tough.
Right. So you were brought in to manage that team and
to merge the two teams.
To merge the two teams.
Yeah, which was, I think, starting out maybe like 50 to 60 people.
Wow.
Which for me, was a lot of people.
Yeah.
Yeah, so, I mean, I wasn't in any way intimidated by the sheer number. I was just very aware at how traumatized the Apple folks were. And it was so tough going from an environment where management was respected to an environment where management was disrespected because so many people had felt burned by their years at Apple. Because Apple was dysfunctional for quite a while. So there were some damaged people. So that was tough.
Were there any other cultural differences that you needed to work out between the two sides?
Oh, tons. As far as compilers go, there was quite a bit of skepticism and maybe even hate towards GCC.
Right.
They had their homebrewed compiler, Mr. C was its name, And even though Apple was investing in that compiler, and it was a very good PowerPC back end, it was slow, and it was getting its butt kicked by CodeWarrior. So, one of the problems there was CodeWarrior owned the developers. CodeWarrior's developers loved the fast turnaround time. The code gen was good enough. And Mr. C got very little exercise other than internally. And I'm sure there were some external. I'm no expert on that, but my intuition says, based on my pretty deep knowledge of MetroWorks, that they owned a significant chunk of the developers.
What, do you think that was because of the IDE? Because I mean, they had CodeWarrior was a full IDE.
It was the IDE.
Right, but Mr. C, you could only use that from MPW, which
Exactly.
was pretty out of date by
Exactly.
that point.
Exactly. And so we were going to stop. We did stop development on Mr. C, and I had to take those people and get them to work on GCC, and that was difficult.
Right.
Very difficult. I think most of them either went away or I had to tell them to go away. I don't remember details, but I tried to mentor some folks through that and had moderate success, but not much, not enough. But it didn't really matter. I mean, I think when you have a merge like that, some people are going to get left behind. I like to think of myself as a mentoring manager, but you have to know when to cut your losses. And I can't say I was really great at it at the time, but I learned quickly. And, so and there were always arguments about, okay, so we're using GCC. Well, are we going to generate function calls like the PEF object file format or Mach-O? And there was
Right, the classic Mac OS used PEF and Next used Mach-O, so there was these fights.
So if we weren't fighting about, Mr. C's a better optimizing compiler than GCC, there were fights about PEF being better than Mach-O. So I had to referee those fights, but Avi's take, and I reported to Avi, was, listen, we're doing GCC and Mach-O, so just tell them that's what we're doing. And, and I could understand from his perspective, that was totally valid advice to give me. But, when you're managing a team and you're trying to be respectful to people who are domain experts, there was definitely some entertainment of, okay, if you feel this is so superior, tell me why. Right. And in so many cases, people couldn't articulate it because they weren't experts on both. They were only experts on one. Right. So, at a very minimum, I had to give them a little time to say, listen, study Mach-O, come back to me, and let me hear you out, because maybe some of these ideas could be worthy of adapting to GCC. I don't want to throw the baby out with the bathwater here, but in almost all cases, none of it made much sense, because an example is, if somehow PEF saved a couple instructions on a function call, but calling a function indirectly like we do in an object-oriented setting is more common, and that's more efficient, you just have to talk about numbers. At the end of the day, you can't talk about these things sort of just willy-nilly on, look at these 2 instructions are better than these 4 instructions. Well, how often do we execute those instructions? Right. There's all this analysis, and no one ever brought me amazing analysis. Right. They would just bring me micro things of, look, it was so frustrating. It was so frustrating.
So like penny wise, pound foolish kind of.
That, or again, they're just naive with the way the next system was operating, because they knew nothing about Objective-C and nothing about the way the dynamic shared libraries worked, or so on and so forth. But maybe even more importantly, and which was Avi's perspective, is I don't care if any of this stuff is better. Our stuff has been proven to work well. So why are we talking about this? Aren't there more important things? So the interesting thing when you have two cultures that are combined, if you just uniformly take Avi's approach of, shut up and just do what we're doing, it's tough to manage a group when you're showing no empathy or respect for what they've done.
Right.
So I was in the middle. It was tough.
Yeah.
It was not a fun time frame for me because, let's face it, as we just discussed, I had a small, finely tuned group for most of my tenure at Next. I still had plenty of time to contribute good engineering work. And so now I had no time with 60 people or however many there were. I was purely mail, management, reprimanding, cajole. It wasn't a technical job anymore. And it was frustrating. And to be honest, over time, I realized it also affected my health. I just was not a happy person. So,
you mentioned Code Warrior. In your resume, one of the big things that you were doing at the time was managing the relationship with MetroWorks. How important was that?
It was mission critical, as Steve likes to say, because let's just take, they owned our developers, right? So, for example, getting them to support and interoperate with Objective-C, critical, right? Getting them to support Carbon, critical. So they were always sort of trying to hold out their hand, so we would put money in it to motivate them to do various things. So it was a really tricky relationship. So I had a really good, because their principals knew I was a compiler guy by trade at Next and was doing lots of the work on the compiler. Because of that, they respected me to do technical negotiations on a lot of this stuff. Greg Galanos, their CEO, was very technically savvy. I don't recall whether Greg was actually a compiler guy at any point, but Greg and I had a great relationship. And I had a good relationship with Andreas Hommel, who was their lead compiler guy, and others there. And so, we coached them on changing their compiler, but that took real work, right? I had to write ABI documents, get them as much detail on plugging into our runtime as possible. But it was an interesting dance because on one level, they own the people Steve wanted me to own, right? Right. And what we all wanted was for Project Builder to be good enough to compete with Code Warrior. Right. And that wasn't going to happen anytime soon. Right. And again, we'll get into that story eventually too. But that wasn't going to happen overnight. And so I had talked with Greg, who was pushing it more for Apple to buy them, to purchase the company.
Wow.
And, I thought that from the beginning that buying the whole company was unlikely to fly with Steve. But buying the parts we wanted might fly. And so there was lots of trying to divide up how it could work, emails that were written. I found some of those emails in my, folders. And in the end, we just kept on getting them to do what we wanted. We never bought the company. I think Motorola bought them eventually.
I think so, yeah.
But by the time Motorola bought them, we were picking up enough steam as a company and a development tools team that it wasn't damaging. But from 97 to 2000 ish, it was painful to be beholden to them. In fact, it was interesting when I was reading some of my appraisals, trying to refresh my memory on what had happened over the years. I see Avi in my appraisal, dinging me for trying to push the MetroWorks acquisition, where he was, saying, basically Steve needs to mature on the business front because he's pushing unrealistic, this acquisition, which makes no sense. And, he's valid to his own opinion. But interestingly, I also found an email from Steve Jobs in '92 that said, I should have listened to you back in the day and bought MetroWorks. And it was really weird how it came up. I have that email somewhere because we were talking about something else, and we were sort of over the hurdle, and I don't think he ever copied Avi on that, and I certainly wasn't going to show Avi. It didn't matter to me at that time. But, it's one of those things where I loved working for Avi, and he was a great guy and a great technologist. But just as he thought I could be overly emotional about some things, sometimes I think he thought his opinion was gospel, and it was odd. He's totally entitled to his opinion that we shouldn't buy MetroWorks. That's a valid opinion. It's invalid to say my business acumen was flawed as a result. In other words, why was I even trying to have a great relationship and coddle it so that we could have purchased them? I mean, in the end, my relationship was so good with them that I could have gotten us a better deal and divided up, the technology such that we would have just paid for, the important things, but never got to that point because Avi was never a fan. And, there's no right or wrong. I just don't really appreciate being dinged for something where there's no right or wrong. It's just so obvious that they owned our developers and that Apple was a big enough company to buy the developer company that owns your developers. It's just really simple. And they had a great C++ compiler. And we wanted that to do Objective-C++. I don't think they ever did that because that was more money. But it was interesting times.
So let's get back to Java then. How did you, or maybe do we want to talk about modern Objective-C first?
Yes.
Which one came first?
Well, they're related.
Okay.
So
first let's explain what modern Objective-C was.
I will, but first let me back up.
Okay.
So as soon as we were able to visualize Java interfaces to our APIs, in other words, we had converted the keyword arguments to Java-style naming, right. And even though some of them weren't pretty, we had done it.
And that had been done at Next already by you.
Yes.
Right.
Yeah, well, I wrote a translator to give a naive translation, but the Kit folks were free to go in and provide a more compact name. Because if you had 3 keywords, just concatenating them kind of looked pretty funny. Okay. But that's here and there. We had Java interfaces that basically look like a standard C++ style naming. So we had done that. So I had said to myself, using DevKit, I'm going to write a DevKit program, which again was the infrastructure to do precompiled headers. I'm going to write a little semantic action routine which transcribes all the Objective-C interfaces, but rather than put it out a Java interface, put out an Objective-C interface and translate the message expressions to something that looks like object dot, just like Java. right? I think, is Java dot or arrow?
It's dot.
Dot, okay.
Yeah.
So I just basically said, let's convert the Objective-C syntax to a Java-like syntax. What that became known as within Apple was the modern Objective-C syntax. So I did this kind of as I was reading so much about how Java and C++ programmers can't stand the Objective-C Smalltalk style naming. So again, I had this tool dev kit, revved it up, and got it to produce a transcription that instead of Java was this syntax that we could basically use for Objective-C proper. And I showed it to Avi, and he got really excited. And we were on the cusp of, I mean, obviously Avi knew, I think Avi knew about the acquisition way before I did. Because
Oh, you had done that modern Objective-C work at Next?
yes.
Oh, it was prior to the acquisition. I didn't know that.
I'm pretty sure I did it. It's really a shame. It's really funny. We used to have a document, and I went out of my way to get rid of that document because there was so much weird trauma related to it. I mean, I found so many documents, I couldn't find anything, and there was a fair amount written because the doc people even revved up to maybe make this change. I do believe it was, if it wasn't right before the acquisition and just related to being a software-only company, it was very soon after while we were in the chasm. Sort of in between the time it was said that we were going to be acquired and then the time we were acquired, which many months spanned. And this was a quick thing. Right. So, I mean, I may have taken a couple weeks to prototype it, and I think it was one of those things where...
So like late December 96 to the first 2 months of 97?
Yeah, I think so. But it sort of made sense as the new Apple that we might want to start fresh with this new syntax because it's more akin to C++ and Java. And I'm not 100% certain that I prototyped it in isolation and then showed it to people, or whether someone sort of said, why don't you prototype this? I really don't have that vivid a memory since it's a while ago, and the way we worked there, it wasn't even important who said, why don't we try this? But so I did it, and Avi got excited, and Ali Ozer's team was not thrilled. So perfect example of the tension between, wow, external programmers that have never seen Smalltalk, aren't familiar with Next, but just want standard dot notation. They'll like this work, but the traditional Next people are having a fit. The other thing to mention of why I almost felt bad that I did the work and even floated it, even though, I mean, I shouldn't feel bad about floating it, but why there was so much excitement being for something that's, to me, really, really simple and superficial, okay? Why I ended up being against it was, again, much more pragmatic. I said, oh my God, Objective-C++ has been such a big thing in Next world. It's going to be probably just as necessary in the Apple world. And the beauty of Objective-C++ is the Objective-C message expressions are clearly segregated and distinct from the C++ code. Right. If we make Objective-C message sends look like C++, you will not be able to tell the difference. Right. Now, you could argue, oh, well, we're going to have a fancy code sense editor, and the code editor will know, which is true. There's no doubt the code editor can know, and the language knows. So there's no ambiguity in terms of the language, but just at a superficial level, it makes the two languages more integrated. which is why people were excited about it on one level. So I thought keeping them syntactically and semantically distinct was better than syntactically similar but semantically distinct.
Right.
And I still feel that that was the right decision. So in the end, I sided with Ali's guys and said, I can't in good faith push this. And I think Avi was very disappointed. And if my only goal in life was to make my manager happy, I would have given in. And he would have made the resources available. But I do imagine he probably, or Ali, talked to him as well. There was enough communication still within the core group of people that I don't remember Avi ever telling me that Ali convinced him that it was the wrong thing to do, or I convinced him. But it's funny because it just sort of dissipated. And I used to have documents for all the stuff, and even that I abolished from my library. There's no remnant that I could find of any of that.
Oh, that's interesting. The story sounds kind of similar to a later thing that we'll talk about maybe in our next session, but like the non-take-up of Objective-C garbage collection sounds like a very similar story.
It's similar in the sense that you have external requirements and needs and wants to be competitive with other languages versus the reality that our kits grew up with in a non-garbage collected world and then went to a manual reference counted world, and trying to evolve to garbage collection is very tricky.
Right.
And but we invested way more in that than we ever did.
Right.
We invested a lot. We were pretty tenacious on that.
Right.
And
I mean, that feature actually shipped, whereas this never even got.
It shipped, but the problem with that feature was getting apps to actually use it. It was so fancy, Hansen, that it was on a per process basis. You could select whether you were going to use automatic garbage collection or manual reference counting. And while that's not tricky for the app, it's very tricky for the frameworks to basically change behavior. And Blaine worked his butt off on that with the kit guys, and it took so long to get any traction. It was painful. It was painful to manage through that. And part of the pain was we converted Xcode to be totally garbage collected, but we didn't have many more mission critical apps. So it was a little concern about whether the dual mode functionality was robust. We were on the bleeding edge with that. And obviously then you're talking about memory management and performance issues that are dependent on some weird flag, which complicates QA and everything. That was a difficult time, and that was like in 92, I believe. No, what am I talking about? This is 2000, 2002, 2003, or maybe later than that.
I think it was later.
Okay.
Yeah, 2006 or 7.
Right.
But yeah, let's get back to the Java then. So how did you get back into working on Java at Apple?
Well, they decided that when they merged the tools teams, that I should take the Java team as well.
Oh, okay.
At an organizational level, it made a ton of sense since I was working on Java. So
you were managing two teams?
Well,
it
was
they
actually,
merged?
I was, the group was called the Java and Advanced Technologies something, or Language Technologies, or They were basically and Java. I forget which was first. Should have my business cards here, but yeah, the team was unified. It wasn't like they were both under me, and Java was pretty strategic then. We were investing a lot in Java because Sun didn't give us any respect at the time. They were flying high and pretty much they were unwilling to help us or invest in it. So we were left holding the bag. But maybe more importantly is Oracle was a big strategic customer, partly because of the Larry-Steve relationship. But no matter why it was, they were strategic and they were really adamant that our Java performance needed to improve. So we actually, here's an area where I decided to go outside. I purchased the Symantec JIT, just-in-time compiler, and integrated it. They had a pretty fast just-in-time compiler, and that helped us for some amount of time. But we also beefed up our Java VM group. I don't know whether this person, someone named Ivan Postfa, who was just an amazing runtime guy. I forget whether he came over from another part of Apple or we hired him, but he was working on Java as well and was just a fabulous runtime guy.
And so the group did the Java for both OS 9 and OS 10.
Correct. Mm-hmm. Yep, and the OS 9 AWT and Swing, eventually Swing work was really vast, because one of the things that we wanted to do is innovate in the area, especially with Swing more than AWT, of having great native look and feel. One of the problems people always had with Java apps is they look pretty bad. And when you have a cross-platform UI library, it's sort of common that cross-platform UI libraries don't look as good as native. So we wanted to take a crack at whether we could upgrade the look. And we did some good work there. But, it almost didn't matter because Java had a reputation of having ugly UIs. Again, sort of another theme, Sun didn't ever develop the killer Swing app that people said, wow, look at that. That's a great app. I want my app to look like that and behave like that. They just didn't really drive Swing from an app perspective. They didn't have that much. I think eventually they developed a browser with it, but it wasn't a great example of a browser. So it sort of showed the limitations.
So the classic classic Macintosh Java product was called MRJ for Macintosh Runtime Java. Is that the correct?
I think so.
Uh-huh. How did that differ from the OS 10 version?
Well, it differed a lot because the Java VM grew up on Unix, since it was a Sun technology. So it really liked having a modern Unix/Mach style operating system under the hood. And so on Mac OS 9, it wasn't. So it required a lot more work. And, I trusted the people working on it at the time. I was not a traditional classic Mac guy. So I don't know where all the bodies were buried on that, but fortunately had a good enough team that, they kept that going and did a lot of the work. Obviously, when Mac OS 10 finally, happened, who knows when now, but it seemed like forever. Then eventually we deprecated and didn't have to invest in that. Right. And that, all that investment in Java, it was tough to swallow, because what Steve would have loved, and I would have loved, is to invest in the tools, to really, through this whole time period, develop a killer IDE that was really going to compete with CodeWarrior. And it wasn't until I decided to step down and get involved in Xcode that that we started to really invest the proper resources in it, because it was very clear that even though we went through a time period where we thought Java was going to take over the world, 4 years later, around 2001, after the acquisition, it was pretty clear Java was faltering on the client and the desktop, and that it wasn't the threat we thought it was going to be. Right. And, there was no reason to, macOS 10 was coming online. So then we started putting more emphasis and resources behind the Xcode rebirth, which was basically a rebirth of Project Builder.
Right. Okay. So, but in the meantime, so it sounds like Java was essentially like a hedge, the Java strategy.
It was a hedge.
Right. Okay.
It was a hedge, and it was important enough to some of our strategic third parties, like Oracle. Even if Oracle was the only company that was happy we were making this investment because it helped them, I guess you could claim that then that was a good investment, because Oracle continues to be such a major player. Right. And at the time, they were still really a major company that we weren't an enterprise play, but it was clear that over time we were going to try and push more into that area. Mm-hmm. Enterprise wasn't a focus of Steve's for a long time, and I don't really know how much his relationship with Larry influenced the investment we were making. I don't remember ever talking about that. All I know is they were put on my radar screen in terms of giving them special love and care, which we did.
So was Oracle using web objects? Why did they need Java from Apple?
Well, just if they were running on the client, they just wanted it to be as fast as possible.
Oh, so Oracle wrote Java software that ran on the Mac.
Exactly.
Oh, okay.
Well, that they wanted to run on the Mac.
Or that they wanted to run on the Mac. Okay.
They were writing. They were all geared up. Java was going to be their cross-platform strategy.
Oh, okay. So Java was the platform that they were going to deploy to.
Exactly.
That would allow them to run anywhere.
Right. So if they have, as you know, they have a tremendous portion of the database market. If even 20% of their customers want to run some of their cross-platform database apps on a Mac client, that's a big number.
Right.
So yeah, that's what it was for.
Right.
It wasn't for bridge. Had nothing to do with the bridge strategy. It was much more about they just want pure Java. Remember that term, pure Java apps to work? Yeah. So.
Yeah. But during this time, Web Objects 5 shipped in a completely Java version. No longer was Objective-C. And then I remember the Cocoa Java was being pushed as a thing. How important were these initiatives overall to the company or to the strategy?
I think if I understand your question, any Objective-C API that was wrapped through Java didn't benefit as much with the Java investment we were making as the pure Java folks. Because when you're using the wrappers, a significant percentage of your code is really in Objective-C. And some code is in pure Java, but relatively small, as opposed to writing a Swing specific app, Java app.
So even Web Objects was bridged.
Exactly.
It wasn't a pure.
I think eventually they did do a pure version, but that history you'd have to talk to a Web Objects person. I know it was initially bridged. And I do remember them pushing to re-implement the whole thing in pure Java.
Right. I think I remember that.
And I do think they did that.
Yeah.
But I don't recall
I think that was 5. I thought.
Was it? Okay. Okay.
That was what I remember, but I don't know for sure.
Well, if they were doing a lot with pure Java, then I'm sure they were interested in some of these basic improvements. Yeah. But I doubt they integrated with Swing, right? They were probably still, well, I don't know. Yeah.
I don't know about that.
This is where it all gets sticky. It's like, it's like from a
Well,
language.
it's a server-side technology, so they didn't have to integrate with the client-side stuff.
They didn't. Okay, it was.
Right.
That's right. It was just server.
Right. So it made sense for web objects to go for pure Java because they were only on the server. Cocoa Java is a different beast because it's a client.
Well, there's no doubt that we had some server clients, but that wasn't where Apple was making most of its money. But you're all right. Whatever few client enterprises we were running on Mac OS X benefited from those improvements. Yeah.
And at this point in time, who did you report to?
Avi.
Avi directly. Okay.
From 97 to 2001, I'm pretty sure for that whole time I reported to Avi.
I mean, at some point, I think you reported.
Well, he left. He I forget which year he left. Oh, he left way later.
He left later, but I think he stopped being the VP of software at some point and became a special advisor to Steve directly, and then
that was after 2001. Yeah.
Right. So I think it was after OS X shipped, and then Bertrand then replaced him as the VP of software.
Right.
So
it was mostly Avi, I'd say.
Right.
Yeah.
And then there was Ted Goldstein at some point was head of
tools
overall.
I hired Ted in 2002 because I wanted to step down and get my hands dirty again with Xcode. And so I told Avi I wanted to hire my replacement. And Avi and Steve begrudgingly let me do that.
But so talk about sort of this, you've mentioned earlier, but this sort of arc of Apple and Java and, sort of the Java's rise and fall on the desktop and whether or not, how well Java was fully supported and the difficulties that Apple had working with Sun. Talk about that whole thing. Why did Java not really pan out, maybe for Apple?
Well, I think at the highest level, Java is about a platform. I know as a tools guy, and a language enthusiast, I like to maybe gravitate towards the language and say, wow, it's cooler than C because it doesn't have header files, doesn't have to deal with the preprocessor, is much cleaner in many regards, has garbage collection from the beginning. So if you just look at it from a language perspective, there's nothing to get too upset over. But Sun was not really all that receptive to separating the Java language from the Java platform. So from their perspective, if you wanted to have a Java language compiler that was a native compiler but didn't support any of their APIs, they weren't interested in that. They wanted it to be indivisible. They wanted the platform to succeed. They were adamant that the platform was where they were going. And that's an OS, right? That's an operating system. And Apple is in the operating system business, right? So while we were smitten with just the language, we had a big clash over the degree to which the language could be separated from the platform and whether we could ever, use it with our platform, without their platform. And they just were never interested in that. Like, for instance, when they were thinking of extending their platform to deal with video, we had made an overture that, we have QuickTime, it's wonderful, why don't you adopt our QuickTime APIs, and which are proven, and we're always driving them. And so we were trying to find a collaborative place to work with them where if they're so adamant about their platform and they're not going to give it up, at least work with us, right? And that was never happening. At the time, they really had a very big ego about where they thought their platform was going. They were convinced, they were really, really convinced that their platform was going to take over. And we weren't in a great bargaining position with them. And Apple was still in a place that was unclear. Things were looking better, no doubt. The company was, from 97 to 2001 was definitely doing better, but it as you know, didn't explode until, iPods and iPhones and all the mobile stuff, which ironically is the domain that Java originally wanted to target, right? More embedded devices like that. So I think it's yet another example where unless you have hardware for a platform to show its energy and to show its prowess and to show how great it is, it's really hard.
Or a killer app, at least.
Yeah. At least. At least. So I think they were drinking a little bit too much Kool-Aid, and eventually Steve just got bored with us trying to work with them. And that's when we started divesting and just worrying about ourselves and just not caring about Java all that much. Obviously, Apple still supports Java. There's still a Java on the system. I have no idea how much Apple does and how much Sun does. Clearly, Apple is in a much more strategic place where if they said to Sun, we're not supporting Java, Sun would. Well, actually, Sun. Oracle, right? Because Sun doesn't exist anymore, which, again, is ironic.
Actually, I think Apple no longer does its own Java. I think you have to download it from Oracle now.
From Oracle, there we go. Yeah. So now the world makes sense, right? The world makes sense because, in fact, that is exactly what should have happened all along. My team and all the work we were doing was a concession that Apple needed to get strong again. And until Apple was strong again, we had to hedge. And, I wasn't savvy enough, or no one predicted the type of success Apple ended up having, right? If you knew that was going to happen, we would have all, behaved differently. But so it's very, very interesting how Sun stumbled big time. But I think one of the lessons someone can learn from that whole, episode was that it never helps you to be so arrogant. And Sun was really arrogant. Because Apple still had an amazing brand, and it just was a shame that Sun didn't respect Apple enough to work closely, make concessions, because I do think Java, the language, might have had more traction if they were more flexible. I don't know. I mean, I can't prove that, but I do think it was an obstacle, their whole attitude.
Well, yeah, Java on the client side never went anywhere, but they did do well on the server.
Yeah, and
they're still
that's
pretty
fine.
dominant in enterprise.
And that's fine. And I'm sure they have a server Java, that Oracle develops server Java for Mac OS X, right? And who knows? But yeah, I don't. The biggest thing, as I say, that was regretful is that all those that hedge was at the expense of the tools, which is why Steve ended up agreeing that in '92 at least, Wait, what?
2000
wait. Why do I keep on going back to 92? What is 92? That's next.
That's when
2002. Yeah, I got too many dates, and we've been going a long time.
So that's when Steve agreed that you're saying.
Well, Steve regrets that we didn't do more with MetroWorks to help cover that time period where we were investing so much more in Java at the expense of the tools.
Right.
But it doesn't seem like at the end of the day it really mattered that much because we had a good relation. Unlike Sun, we had a really good relationship with Code Warrior, and they ended up making the transitions that we needed and the processor changes, and because there's so many things that are dependent on the tools, and anytime the OS or infrastructure changes, there's a likelihood the tools might need to rev. And I take some credit for that because, again, I worked really well with them and coddled them through some of that, along with developer relations, Clint Richardson and his team. Right. So it was a team effort, but we certainly didn't act arrogantly. We respected that they had our developers in their hip pocket.
Right.
Yeah.
And of course that was to support the Carbon transition, right? Because the Cocoa developers were still using Project Builder from the next version, or the old next Project Builder.
Correct.
Right.
Correct, but we wanted to get the Carbon people over to our newer the new APIs, so them supporting Objective-C to support that transition was much easier for their developers than asking their developers to go to more Unix-centric tools and so on.
So the goal was to have Code Warrior be, you could program Cocoa using Code Warrior. That was the goal. Right.
Exactly.
Okay.
And they did modify their compiler to do Objective-C. Mm-hmm. Oh yeah.
I just don't remember if anybody actually used Code Warrior to program in Cocoa.
Well, chances are you weren't hanging with that crowd. I don't think we know.
Right.
And I can't say I had great or remember exactly how many people were doing it. Right. But independent of that, it needed to exist for it to even be possible. Right. Because the other proposition of ditching Code Warrior just to use a couple of our APIs, if that's what you needed, that's a big.
So it had to be a big check mark on the business end so that people could justify.
It's an enabler.
Sticking with the platform, essentially.
Exactly.
Right.
Exactly. Because the platform was, the number of Cocoa boxes out there still wasn't vast. I mean, there were still a lot of developers that, either would threaten they're not moving their code over or ask Apple to finance their development for an awful long time until we gained traction. Like now it's wonderful, obviously. Apple has so many developers because they sell so many devices. But before all that success, developers were an angry mob that just didn't want to do any work without proof there were, millions of dollars at the end of the tunnel.
All right. I guess we'll end there and pick up when you start working on Xcode next time.
Great.
Yeah.
Thanks.
I guess I'll just maybe I'll just say at the end that you mentioned the iPhone. Sort of the irony behind all of this is that the iPhone ended up driving up the adoption of Objective-C way beyond what it was before.
Oh, yeah. Well, it was proof that Steve was right when he said, all we have to do is sell more units, and believe me, they'll flock to the language and the APIs. And clearly they did, and clearly the iPhone offered a compelling experience. So, yeah, the apps out there are just incredible.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Thank you.